Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a time when candlelight flickered on stone walls, when the air was thick with incense and superstition, and when the meaning of your dreams could determine whether you were considered blessed by heaven or just possessed. So, take a breath, pull the blanket up, dim the lights a little more, because tonight we're stepping softly into the peculiar world of medieval dreams, where sleep wasn't just rest, but a place of messages, warnings, and sometimes nonsense. Dreams today are often seen as random little films stitched together by your brain. One moment you're at school, the next you're flying through the sky, and somehow your grandmother is also there, wearing sunglasses indoors. But for people in the Middle Ages, dreams were never just dreams. They were maps, signs, and occasionally excuses. Medieval scholars and theologians spent centuries trying to decide exactly what a dream was. Was it a message from God? A temptation from the devil? Or simply the result of eating too much cabbage before bed? Unsurprisingly, the answer they came to was all of the above. Let's ease into this. In monasteries, where monks had far too much time and not enough entertainment, dreams became a subject of real fascination. Saint Augustine himself, who lived a bit earlier but whose influence stretched long into the Middle Ages, declared that dreams could reveal divine truths. Naturally, this gave a lot of people hope. If your dream involved angels, glowing light, or perhaps a helpful saint reminding you to be nice to your neighbors, you could safely announce at breakfast that you had received a holy vision. Of course, there was also the less comforting possibility that your dream was from the devil. Demonic dreams were taken very seriously. If you dreamed of lustful temptations, or of shadowy figures leading you astray, well, clearly Satan had popped into your sleep schedule for a chat. And since half of medieval life was about blaming the devil for things, toothaches, storms, and probably flat beer, it made perfect sense that he would also meddle with your dreams. But not everyone agreed on the source of dreams. Some leaned on more practical explanations. Medieval medical theory, grounded in the ancient teachings of Galen, argued that dreams were caused by bodily humors. If you dreamed of fire, perhaps your body was too hot with yellow bile. If you dreamed of drowning, maybe you had too much phlegm. Essentially, your dreams were your stomach's fault, which explains why medical texts often included dream interpretation alongside diet advice. Too much cheese, too many strange visions. Now, let's imagine the ordinary medieval sleeper. Picture a peasant, exhausted after working the fields, collapsing onto a straw mattress. His dreams might be full of simple images: bread, animals, maybe a fleeting glimpse of saints. But these were not dismissed as trivial. A dream of bread could be interpreted as prosperity or famine, depending on who you asked. Medieval dream books, known as oniricritica, circulated widely, offering pages of helpful interpretations. Dream of a wolf? Danger. Dream of gold? Fortune. Dream of your teeth falling out? The death of a relative. Yes, that one has been haunting humans for centuries. Even kings and nobles consulted these dream manuals, because nothing says effective ruler quite like deciding military campaigns based on whether you dreamed of fish or of a particularly aggressive goose. One famous example comes from King Henry I of England. According to chroniclers, he once dreamed of his teeth falling out. His advisors immediately declared it a bad omen. someone close to him would die. Naturally, they were right. His son perished not long after in the infamous White Ship disaster, which raises the question, were medieval dream interpretations insightful, or just vague enough to always come true? But dreams weren't just personal. They shaped entire cultures of storytelling. The medieval period loved dream visions, long poems or allegories where the narrator falls asleep and is transported to another world. Think of works like The Romance of the Rose, where the dreamer explores gardens full of personified concepts like love, jealousy, and idleness, or Dante's Divine Comedy, which, while technically later, still follows that idea of dreams as portals to cosmic truths. Of course, the dream vision genre was also a convenient way for writers to say outrageous things. You could claim, "Oh, don't blame me, it was just a dream," much safer than directly criticizing the nobility or the church. If your allegorical dream just happened to include a greedy bishop drowning in a river of wine, well, you could insist it wasn't personal. Now, let's drift into one of the stranger corners of medieval dream science: nightmares. The word nightmare itself comes from the Old English mare, a kind of malicious spirit believed to sit on your chest while you slept, suffocating you. Many people in the Middle Ages believed nightmares weren't just unpleasant. They were physical assaults by demons. This belief probably arose from sleep paralysis, which, if you've ever experienced it, is unsettling enough to make you believe in evil spirits. Imagine waking up unable to move, feeling pressure on your chest, and seeing shadowy figures in the room. To a medieval mind, that wasn't brain chemistry. That was Satan paying rent-free visits. So exorcisms, prayers, and charms were often prescribed for troubled dreamers. Some people even kept relics or holy water by their bed to ward off nighttime intrusions. Because nothing quite says sweet dreams like surrounding your pillow with bones of saints. But not all dream talk was gloomy. Dreams could also be excuses for indulgence. If a noble dreamed of victory, he might see it as divine encouragement to start a war. If a monk dreamed of feasting, he might sheepishly interpret it as a reminder to fast more. In fact, confession manuals often warned priests to ask about dreams during confessions, because naturally, even your subconscious could be sinful. And then there were the romantic dreams. Troubadour poetry in southern France loved to depict knights dreaming of their beloved, or ladies dreaming of gallant lovers. These dreams blurred the line between divine inspiration and human desire. Were they messages from God, or just too much daydreaming about the neighbor's squire? Medieval culture didn't always clarify. By the late Middle Ages, dream science became even more tangled, thanks to the blend of Christian belief, folk superstition, and classical texts rediscovered through Arabic translations. Aristotle's ideas about dreams being tied to sensory impressions mixed awkwardly with church teachings. So you could end up with a scholar seriously debating whether dreaming of apples was a natural brain hiccup, a sign of spiritual temptation, or just the result of seeing too many apple orchards that day. The answer, of course, was often all three. Medieval scholars loved a good both/and solution. Dreams were divine and demonic and medical, all at once. Because why settle on one explanation when you could have a wholly devilish humoral hybrid theory? But perhaps the most endearing thing about medieval dreams is how human they feel. Despite the layers of theology, philosophy, and superstition, the anxieties behind them are familiar. Fear of death, hope for love, worry about food, dread of illness. In the end, medieval dreamers weren't so different from us. They just had more saints and demons in the script. So, as you drift further into your own dreams tonight, imagine lying on a straw bed in a cold stone room, listening to the wind whistle through the shutters, clutching a charm against evil spirits, and hoping your dreams would bring you not nightmares, but visions of bread, gold, or maybe a kindly angel. Because in the Middle Ages, even your dreams were never entirely your own. Hey everyone, let's drift a little farther back tonight. We're moving away from the quiet candlelit chambers of medieval dreamers and stepping into the smoky longhouses of the Norse. The Vikings, of course, have been reduced in pop culture to big men in horned helmets, which inconveniently they never wore, smashing mugs of ale together and roaring with laughter. And while that image isn't entirely accurate, it's not entirely wrong either. Their feasts were loud, chaotic, and more than a little sticky. So, settle in, dim the lights. Imagine the creak of a wooden hall in the winter, the flicker of firelight on shields hanging along the walls, and the not-so-delicate scent of smoked fish wafting through the air. We're about to float into the world of Viking banquets, with all the mead, mystery, and mild food poisoning you might expect. A hall built for noise. First, let's picture the setting. A Viking banquet usually took place in a longhouse, and the name tells you most of what you need to know. It was long, and it was a house. These halls were built with timber frames and walls, sometimes lined with turf for insulation, which meant they were basically enormous wooden thermoses. At the center ran a hearth fire, smoky and uneven, but essential for cooking, warmth, and, incidentally, staining everyone's clothes a permanent shade of ash gray. Ventilation was not exactly a priority. On feast nights, benches would be dragged close to long wooden tables. Chieftains sat at the high seat, near the fire, while everyone else found their spot according to rank. If you were at the far end of the hall, congratulations, you were socially unimportant, and your stew was probably cold by the time it reached you. The walls weren't bare either. Shields and weapons often lined the sides, both for decoration and for easy access if a drunken brawl broke out, which it often did. Imagine combining a wedding reception, a rugby match, and a poorly managed barbecue, and you'll have the general atmosphere. Mead, the sticky glue holding it all together. No Viking banquet was complete without mead. Mead, for those lucky enough never to taste it, is essentially honey wine. Sweet, strong, and deceptively easy to drink until you realize you've just declared war on Denmark, and you're not entirely sure why. Mead wasn't just a beverage, it had almost mystical connotations. In Norse mythology, there was the legendary mead of poetry, a divine drink that granted wisdom and eloquence. In practice, though, it mostly granted slurred speeches and the occasional vomit pile in the corner of the longhouse. Of course, not everyone was drinking high-quality honey mead. Ordinary folk had ale, brewed from barley, oats, or rye. This was sometimes flavored with herbs, because nothing says flavor like chewing on a twig. The wealthy might indulge in imported wine, though honestly, it usually didn't travel well. A sour amphora of Roman red was probably about as luxurious as it sounds. The food, more creative than you'd think. The food itself, was surprisingly varied. Vikings ate what they could grow, herd, or steal. So, lots of barley bread, porridge, and dairy. Cows and sheep provided milk for cheese and butter, while pigs and goats were regularly turned into something you might call roast, but only if you were generous with definitions. Fish was everywhere, of course. Dried, smoked, salted, sometimes all three at once, for maximum chewiness. If you were lucky, you might get herring. If you were less lucky, you got fermented shark. That particular dish, known as harkal, still exists in Iceland today, and it has been politely described as tasting like a cleaning product that recently died. At banquets, meat was the star. Cattle, pigs, and sheep would be slaughtered for the occasion. Cooking was rustic, boiled in enormous cauldrons, or roasted on spits over the fire. Think stew, lots of it, sometimes flavored with onions, leeks, or herbs gathered nearby. And yes, there were occasional delicacies. Archaeologists have found evidence of exotic imports in Viking sites: walnuts, spices, even raisins. These came from trade or raids, proving that one man's plundered monastery was another man's dessert topping. Rituals and rank. Banquets weren't just about food. They were social performances. The chieftain presided at the high table, doling out gifts and favors to keep loyalty intact. Warriors were recognized for their deeds, sometimes with rings, sometimes with praise, and sometimes just with an extra ladle of stew. Speeches were made, oaths were sworn, feuds were settled, and occasionally, new feuds were started when someone swore a little too aggressively. One important ritual was the toasting sequence. Guests drank in honor of the gods, the ancestors, and the king or chieftain. Odin first, naturally, then Thor, because nobody wanted to risk offending the guy with the hammer. After that, the order varied, but it was always long. You didn't just raise a glass once. You raised it repeatedly until your arm was tired and your liver was plotting rebellion. Games, songs, and fights. Between rounds of food and drink, there was entertainment. Skalds, poets, recited long, winding sagas about heroes and gods. These could go on for hours, and given the mead consumption, most of the audience probably remembered only about 3 words the next day. Music was simple. Flutes, lyres, and drums provided rhythm for songs, which could be solemn or raucous depending on the mood. Dancing happened too, though dancing here probably resembled stomping, shouting, and occasionally falling into the fire. And of course, there were games. Some were board games, like Hnefatafl, a sort of Viking chess where the goal was to trap the king. Others were more physical, wrestling, tests of strength, or good old-fashioned brawls. Because nothing says community bonding like punching your neighbor over the last piece of pork. Guests you really didn't want. It's worth mentioning that not everyone at these banquets was welcome. Uninvited guests, especially from rival clans, could show up and cause trouble. The sagas are full of feasts that ended in bloodshed. One classic tale involves the notorious Viking Egil Skallagrimsson, who was both a warrior and a poet. At one banquet, he composed an insulting poem about his host, and then, as one does, killed one of the man's sons. You could say Egil wasn't great at small talk. Even within the same clan, Tensions ran high. A sideways glance, an offhand remark, or simply too much ale could spark a fight. And since everyone was already holding a knife for cutting meat, escalation was quick. Imagine Thanksgiving dinner, except with more axes. Food preservation, a necessary evil. One of the less glamorous parts of Viking cuisine was the preservation. Without refrigerators, everything had to be salted, dried, or smoked, which meant much of the food at banquets was, let's say, seasoned with more enthusiasm than freshness. Fermentation was common, not just for alcohol, but for fish and dairy. Fermented fish, for example, was not exactly a crowd pleaser, but it kept people alive through the winter. Butter was sometimes stored underground, where it developed a taste described, politely, as distinctive. So yes, Viking banquets had meat and mead, but they also had some truly suspicious side dishes. And yet, people ate heartily, because when you live in a world of unpredictable harvests, famine, and occasional raids by your neighbors, you don't turn down calories just because they smell like despair. Gender at the feast. Interestingly, women played important roles at these gatherings. While men were doing the dramatic toasts and occasional dueling, women often managed the practical side, brewing the ale, serving the food, and ensuring the rituals were properly observed. In Norse myth, goddesses like Freya were honored at feasts, and in real life, women could wield significant influence in deciding who sat where, who got served first, and who left the hall insulted and angry, which, in a society that valued honor above all else, was not a small responsibility. A banquet for the dead. Feasts weren't only for the living. Sometimes, banquets were held in honor of the dead. Archaeologists have found grave sites with animal bones and drinking vessels, suggesting that food and drink were offered to the deceased. In the sagas, great warriors were imagined continuing their feasting in Valhalla, drinking endless mead served by Valkyries. So when Vikings sat down in their smoky halls, they weren't just eating, they were reenacting cosmic myths. Every toast echoed the gods. Every bite of meat was a reminder of abundance, and every quarrel was a rehearsal for the battles of legend. The morning after, and of course, every feast had a morning after. Picture the longhouse at dawn. The fire burned down to ash, the floor sticky with spilled ale, half-eaten chunks of bread lying forgotten, a warrior snoring loudly in the corner while another tries to remember why his tunic is on backward. Feasts were exhausting, but they were central to Viking life. They weren't just parties, they were politics, religion, community, and sometimes thinly disguised battlefields. So that's the Viking banquet. Smoky halls, sticky mead, suspicious fish, and just enough violence to keep things interesting. And with that image lingering, let's drift gently onward into the next curious corner of history. Hey everyone, tonight we're shifting again. We're leaving behind the smoky longhouses of the Vikings, where the mead was sticky and the fish was regrettable, and we're wandering instead into the marble streets of Rome. Now, when people think of ancient Rome, they picture grand things, colosseums, senators in togas, armies marching in lockstep. But lurking beneath all that marble grandeur was a society deeply obsessed with the invisible. The Romans were practical people. Yes, famous for aqueducts, roads, and tax collection, but they were also profoundly superstitious. They believed in omens. They believed in curses. They believed that sneezing at the wrong time could ruin your day, or that stepping on the wrong threshold might doom your marriage. And naturally, they made it all extremely bureaucratic because of course they did. So, dim your lights, sink into your pillow, and let's drift into the quietly anxious world of Roman superstitions. Signs in the sky. Let's begin with the Romans' favorite habit, staring at the sky and panicking about it. If a thunderstorm rolled in unexpectedly, or lightning struck somewhere inconvenient, this was never just weather. No, this was a message from the gods, which meant someone, usually a professional priest called an augur, had to interpret it. The augurs specialized in divination, particularly by watching birds, and not in a gentle, birdwatcher kind of way. They'd study how the birds flew, where they landed, whether they squawked too much. Imagine your life decisions, your marriage, your business, even whether or not to go to war, being determined by a pigeon's questionable sense of direction. Lightning, too, was taken seriously. A bolt striking a building meant divine anger. It required rituals of purification, which generally involved sacrifices and a lot of hand-waving. The Romans even had a state official whose entire job was to record every instance of lightning across the empire, a sort of storm accountant. Lucky days and unlucky days. Roman calendars weren't just about keeping track of months. They were also marked with which days were auspicious and which days were not. Some days were considered so unlucky that even leaving your house could be dangerous. These were called dies nefasti, which basically meant, don't even try it. On such days, holding an assembly or conducting legal business was forbidden, which must have been convenient for anyone who simply didn't feel like going to court. There were also lucky days, but luck was fickle. What was good for one thing could be bad for another. So while it might be the perfect day for planting crops, it could be disastrous for a wedding. This made scheduling complicated. You couldn't just pick a date and go with it. You had to make sure the god's calendar matched yours. The evil eye. Like many ancient cultures, the Romans were terrified of the evil eye. This was the idea that envy or malice could be transmitted through a glare, causing illness, misfortune, or your grapes to shrivel. The logic was simple. The symbol of fertility was stronger than envy. If someone glared at you with malice, your amulet would glare back, rather rudely, and cancel out the curse. Ghosts in the house. Romans also had a complicated relationship with the dead. They believed in manes, spirits of the ancestors, who were generally friendly if respected properly. Offerings of food and wine were made at family shrines. Forget to honor them, though, and they could become cranky. But there were also Lemures, restless and sometimes hostile spirits. These showed up in the dead of night, naturally, and could bring illness or chaos to a household. To keep them at bay, the Romans performed the Lemuria festival. Each May the head of the household would walk barefoot through the home at midnight, spitting out black beans to distract the spirits. Because obviously, ghosts can't resist free beans. If the beans didn't work, the man would clang bronze pots together while chanting. It was essentially the Roman version of yelling at your house to stop being haunted. Love, potions, and bad ideas. Superstition also played a large role in Roman love life. Love spells were common, often involving wax figurines of the desired person, sometimes stabbed with pins. Nothing says romance quite like ritualized doll mutilation. There were also potions, aphrodisiacs brewed from herbs, animal parts, or stranger things. Unfortunately, many of these concoctions were more toxic than helpful. Let's just say the line between love potion and slow poisoning was alarmingly thin. For married couples, omens lurked everywhere. A bride had to be carried over the threshold, not because it was cute, but because tripping on the doorway was considered disastrous. Weddings were carefully timed, avoiding unlucky days, and sometimes scheduled for the second half of June, which was considered blessed by the goddess Juno. Everyday oddities. The Romans had endless little superstitions woven into daily life. Dropping bread on the floor was a bad sign. Meeting a pig on your way to work was unlucky, though, frankly, it seems unlucky for the pig as well. Certain numbers carried weight, like the mystical power of odd numbers. Even their spells often involved repeating words 3 or 9 times. And of course, sneezing. A sneeze was thought to expel spirits from the body, so it was polite to wish someone health afterward, which is basically the ancestor of bless you. Even crossing thresholds required care. The threshold of a home was sacred, linked to the household gods. Step wrongly, and you might bring disaster into your family, which makes you wonder how many Romans froze at the door just waiting for the right foot to feel lucky. Politics, power, and paranoia. Superstitions weren't just private quirks. They reached right into Roman politics. Leaders often used omens to justify decisions. If an augur declared the omens bad, an election could be postponed. If lightning struck at the wrong time, a law could be repealed. It was a wonderfully flexible system. You could always blame the gods when you wanted a do-over. One famous example involves Julius Caesar. On the morning of his assassination, there were multiple bad omens, strange dreams, sacrificed animals with missing hearts, even his wife Calpurnia begging him not to go to the Senate. Naturally, he ignored them all, because when has a powerful man ever taken advice at the right moment? Curses and dark magic. Superstitions also took darker forms. Romans believed in defictiones, curse tablets. These were thin sheets of lead inscribed with pleas to the gods, or demons, to harm someone, enemies, rivals, or even unfaithful lovers could be cursed. The tablets were often folded up and nailed, then buried in graves or thrown into wells to activate their power. Thousands of these tablets have been found by archaeologists, many of them shockingly petty. One might ask the gods to ruin someone's business, another to make a rival's horse stumble. Some even targeted actors who had offended the writer. Truly, no profession escapes criticism. The sheer number of cursed tablets shows how everyday this practice was. Romans lived surrounded by invisible grudges, all etched into metal and hidden in the earth. Animals, omens, and awkward chickens. We can't talk about Roman superstitions without mentioning the sacred chickens. Yes, chickens. The Romans used them to predict the outcome of battles. Priests would release a group of specially kept hens before an army marched. If the chickens ate eagerly, it was a good sign. If they refused, it was a bad omen. At least one Roman commander, Publius Claudius Pulcher, famously lost a battle after ignoring the chickens' warning. When they wouldn't eat, he threw them into the sea, saying, "If they won't eat, let them drink." The gods, apparently, were not amused. His fleet was promptly destroyed. So yes, Entire Roman campaigns depended on the appetites of poultry. Truly, the empire was built on solid foundations. The anxiety beneath the marble. And so the Romans sprinkled salt, chanted spells, bribed the gods with sacrifices, and nervously checked the chickens, just to get through the day. So there you have it, the forgotten world of Roman superstitions. From beans for ghosts to chickens deciding wars. From cursed tablets buried in wells to tiny amulets swinging on children's necks. It's a reminder that even the most rational-looking societies often live under invisible rules, strange, comforting, and sometimes hilariously impractical. Now, with that thought, let's drift onward to our next curious corner of history. Hey everyone! Tonight we're pulling away from Rome's marble arches and wandering into something quieter, colder too. Imagine an old stone monastery tucked away in the hills of medieval Europe. The air smells faintly of wax, damp parchment, and cabbage stew. Bells toll in the distance, marking another hour in a life that was carefully scheduled down to the minute. Yes, we're drifting into the world of medieval monks. Now, monks often appear in our imagination as serene, solemn figures, hooded, chanting by candlelight, patiently illuminating manuscripts in golden script. But the reality was complicated. Their lives were strict, often bizarre, and occasionally just plain petty. So, settle into your pillow, dim the lights, and let's drift slowly through the peculiar daily lives of those who gave up the world, only to build an entirely new one behind cloister walls. The Rule of Saint Benedict. Let's begin with their rule book, because naturally monks had one. The Rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, became the backbone of Western monastic life. It outlined how monks should live, in obedience, humility, and community. It emphasized stability. Once you joined, you weren't supposed to leave, and it demanded an orderly schedule of prayer, work, and rest. At first glance, it sounds peaceful. A little prayer, a little gardening, some bread and water. But when you look closer, you realize it was designed to crush individuality. Every action was dictated. When to eat, when to sleep, when to speak, or more often, when not to. So yes, monks weren't so much free spirits as spiritual bureaucrats, bound not by kings, but by the bell. The endless bells. If you lived in a monastery, your life was ruled by bells. Bells rang at dawn for matins, the first prayers. They rang again for lauds, then again for prime, and so on. 7 or 8 services every single day. Even the night wasn't safe. Matins often happened in the middle of the night, dragging sleepy monks out of bed to chant psalms in freezing chapels. Imagine being half asleep, wrapped in a rough wool robe, shuffling barefoot across cold stone to mumble Latin in the dark. Holy, yes, but also deeply exhausting. The silence. Silence was prized in many monasteries. Too much chatter was seen as worldly. To avoid temptation, monks often developed complex systems of hand signals. Want salt at the dinner table? There was a gesture for that. Need to borrow a book? Another gesture. Want to politely signal that Brother Thomas has, once again, fallen asleep in prayers? Well, subtle throat clearing usually worked. The silence wasn't perfect, of course. Monks still gossiped, still muttered complaints. Humans will always find a way. food, and fasting. Now, about their food. Romantic images of monks baking crusty loaves and brewing fine ales aren't entirely wrong. But daily meals were far less glamorous. Meat was usually banned, except for the sick, so most meals were vegetables, beans, porridge, and bread, fish, if they were lucky, eggs and cheese on special days, and fasting. Oh, there was a lot of fasting. Not just Lent, but frequent smaller fasts throughout the year, which often meant the monks spent a lot of time thinking about food while pretending not to. There are records of monasteries sneaking around the meat rule by classifying beavers as fish, because, you see, they had tails and lived in water. Convenient theology, if you ask me. The peculiar beds. Sleep was another curious matter. Monks often slept in large communal dormitories, on straw mattresses or wooden boards, with their clothes on. This wasn't just modesty, it was practicality. If the bell rang for night prayers, you had to leap out of bed immediately, robe and all. Beds were arranged with feet facing one another, so no one's head was too close to another. Privacy didn't exist. Snoring did, though, and no amount of divine patience could make it pleasant. Work and prayer. The motto was ora et labora, pray and work. Monks worked in fields, tended sheep, brewed beer, copied manuscripts, and kept gardens. Their monasteries were often self-sufficient, little islands of survival in a chaotic medieval world. The scriptoria, writing rooms, were especially fascinating. Here, monks painstakingly copied texts, letter by letter, not just holy books, but also classical works, which is why so much of ancient literature survived. Imagine hours bent over vellum, in dim candlelight, correcting mistakes with a knife blade. It was tedious, but also strangely heroic. Some manuscripts include tiny notes in the margins, revealing very human frustrations. "Oh, my hand is tired," one monk scrawled. Another wrote, "It is very cold today." A personal favorite reads simply, "I don't like this place," which is about as relatable as it gets. Strange rules and petty punishments. Monks had rules for everything. If you laughed too much at dinner, you might have to eat your next meal on the floor. If you dropped bread, you had to kiss it before picking it up. If you arrived late to prayers, you stood at the back until forgiven. One rule even forbade monks from blessing themselves too extravagantly with the sign of the cross. Subtlety was important. Too much flair was suspicious. And yes, monks could be punished for falling asleep during services, which, given the endless hours of chanting at 3 a.m., seems cruel. Monastic fashion. As for fashion, robes were plain, usually brown, black, or gray, depending on the order. Shoes were simple leather. Hairstyles? Distinctive. The tonsure, that famous shaved crown, marked them as monks. Some versions left only a thin circle of hair like a halo. Others removed nearly everything, creating what can only be described as a medieval bowl cut gone wrong. The idea was humility. The effect was less than flattering. Peculiar pastimes. When not praying, working, or obeying rules, monks had their odd little pastimes. Some specialized in brewing beer, and these brews became renowned. Others experimented with herbal remedies, making monastic gardens into laboratories of sorts. A few even dabbled in astronomy, though always carefully, since the stars belonged to God, not astrology. Music was central. Gregorian chant, with its long, droning notes, was designed not to entertain, but to dissolve the self into something larger. Imagine the sound echoing off stone walls in candlelit halls, hypnotic, sleep-inducing, perhaps not unlike this monologue. Monks and mischief. Despite the vows, monks were not saints. There are plenty of records of monks sneaking food, grumbling about abbots, even smuggling wine into dormitories. Some monasteries became wealthy and lax, with abbots living more like princes. The church repeatedly tried to reform them, with new stricter orders springing up whenever the old ones grew too indulgent. And sometimes, monks simply fought each other. Yes, in cloisters, with sticks or fists. Human nature is stubborn, even in a robe. Monks as storytellers. We also owe monks for many of the weird little miracle tales of the Middle Ages. They loved collecting stories of saints, visions, and supernatural events. A monk might spend his evenings writing about a farmer who saw angels in a field, or a local relic that cured headaches, or perhaps a brother who fell asleep during prayer and dreamed of demons tugging his toes. These stories spread across Europe, feeding the medieval imagination. Half folklore, half theology, they reveal how monks shaped the culture beyond their walls. The long shadow of routine. At the heart of monastic life was routine. Days bled into each other, marked only by bells and seasons. Winter meant cold chapels, frozen ink, and thin soups. Summer brought longer hours in the fields. It was monotonous, yes, but for many monks, that was the point. To escape the chaos of medieval society, wars, plagues, taxes, feudal squabbles, and replace it with rhythm and prayer. In a world of uncertainty, the cloister offered predictability. So, as we drift away from the cloister walls tonight, picture them. Rows of hooded figures chanting in candlelight, gardens lined with herbs, tired scribes sighing over endless parchment. Strange lives, peculiar rules, but a steady hum of devotion. The peculiar lives of medieval monks, not always holy, not always peaceful, but endlessly human.